The cup shattered on the stone floor the moment Alara Whitmore heard the carriage wheels stop outside the manor gates. Tea splashed across her apron, hot and sudden, but she barely felt it. Her eyes were fixed on the tall figure stepping down from the carriage, dressed in a fine gray coat, wearing the face of the man she had served tea to every morning for almost a year. The man she knew as Colton, the quiet, stable hand who never spoke of his past. Except now the entire staff of Ashcombe Manor was bowing to him. Now they were calling him Duke. Just minutes earlier, Alara had been carrying a tray through the kitchen corridor, humming softly, thinking about nothing more than the fresh bread cooling on the counter and the long list of chores waiting for her. She had no idea that her entire world was about to tilt sideways. Alara had worked at Ashcombe Manor since she was 16. Her mother had been a laundress there before her, and when her mother passed away from a long illness, the housekeeper, a kind but strict woman named Margaret Doyle, had taken Alara in and given her a place in the kitchens. That had been 6 years ago. Now Alara was 22, with quick hands, a sharp mind, and a habit of waking before the sun to start the ovens. It was during one of those early mornings, almost a year ago, that she first met the stable hand. She remembered it clearly. The sky had still been dark, the air cold enough to bite at her fingers, and she had been carrying a pot of tea to the kitchen table when she noticed a light flickering in the stable. Curious, she walked over, expecting to find one of the older grooms checking on a sick horse. Instead, she found a young man sitting on an overturned crate, sharpening a set of old tools with careful, practiced hands. He looked up at her with tired eyes, said nothing at first, only nodded politely. There was something different about him. His hands were rough like a working man's, but his voice, when he finally spoke to thank her for the light she was carrying, was smooth and careful, almost like he had been taught to speak that way. She thought nothing of it at the time. Plenty of people ended up in service for reasons they didn't talk about. "You're new," she had said. "Started yesterday," he replied. "Name's Colton." "Alara," she said, and something about the way he repeated her name, slowly, like he wanted to remember it, made her smile despite the cold. The next morning she brought him tea. She told herself it was just kindness, the same kindness she would show any new worker on the estate who had to wake before dawn and work in the cold without complaint. But the morning after that she brought tea again. And the morning after that. Soon, it became something neither of them spoke about, but both of them expected. Every morning, just before the sun rose over the hills behind Ashcombe Manor, Alara would slip out to the stable with a small cup of tea, and Colton would be waiting, brushing down a horse or mending a bridle, always with a quiet smile ready for her. They talked about small things at first, the weather, the horses, the other workers on the estate. Slowly, over weeks, the conversations grew longer. Colton asked about her life, her mother, her dreams beyond the walls of the manor. Alara found herself telling him things she had never told anyone else, not even Margaret, who had practically raised her. She noticed things about him, too. The way he sometimes stared out toward the hills with a distant, almost sad look in his eyes. The way he never mentioned any family, any home before Ashcombe. The way his hands, though calloused from stable work, moved with a strange elegance when he held a teacup, like he had been trained since childhood in manners far above his current station. Once she had asked him directly, "Where are you from, Colton? You don't talk like a stable hand." He had laughed, a short, careful laugh. "Is that an insult or a compliment?" "Neither, just an observation." He had looked at her for a long moment, and for a second she thought he might actually tell her the truth. But then he simply said, "I had a good teacher once. That's all," and changed the subject to the health of one of the mares. Alara let it go. She told herself it wasn't her business. People came to work at grand estates for all kinds of reasons, and many of them carried secrets they didn't want to share. She respected that. And besides, whatever secrets Colton carried, they didn't change the fact that he was kind to her, that he listened when she spoke, that he remembered small details about her life that even her closest friends among the staff sometimes forgot. Winter came, and with it came harder mornings. The stable was cold, and Alara began wrapping the teapot in a cloth to keep it warm during her walk across the courtyard. Colton noticed this small effort, and one morning he surprised her with a scarf, plain and simple, but clearly handmade. "I asked one of the maids to teach me," he admitted, looking almost embarrassed. "I wanted to thank you properly for the tea." Alara had worn that scarf every single morning since. Their friendship deepened through the seasons, though neither of them gave it a name. Alara knew, deep in her heart, that what she felt for Colton was more than simple friendship, but she also knew the boundaries of her world. She was a kitchen maid, born into service, and he was, as far as she knew, a stable hand with mysterious manners and a hidden past. Even if there had been something more between them, the walls of the world they lived in would never allow it to grow. Still, she cherished those mornings. They became the anchor of her days, the quiet moment before the noise and labor of the manor swallowed her whole. She would wake in the dark, dress quickly, warm the tea, and walk across the frosty courtyard with her heart lighter than it had any right to be. Then came the day the old Duke died. News spread through Ashcombe Manor like wildfire. The Duke, a reclusive man who had rarely been seen outside his private study in the past decade, had passed away quietly in his sleep. The staff buzzed with whispers about what would happen next. He had no wife, no children that anyone knew of, and the estate's future suddenly felt uncertain. Some said a distant cousin would inherit. Others whispered about lawyers being sent for, about a search being conducted for an heir nobody had ever met. Alara noticed the change in Colton almost immediately. He grew quiet, more distant than usual. He still met her every morning, still drank his tea, but his eyes seemed to carry a weight she hadn't seen before. When she asked if he was all right, he only said, "Just thinking about the future. Things change fast in a place like this." She didn't press him further. Everyone on the estate was anxious about the future. It made sense that he would be too. But 3 mornings later, Alara arrived at the stable with the teapot in her hands, and Colton was gone. Not gone for the day, not gone to run an errand. Gone entirely. His small quarters above the stable were empty, his few belongings taken. When she asked the head groundskeeper, a stern man named Walter Higgins, he only said that Colton had been called away on urgent family matters and offered nothing more. Alara felt a hollow ache she hadn't expected. She told herself it was foolish to feel this way about a man who had never made her any promises, who had never been anything more than a quiet companion during cold mornings. But the ache remained, settling into her chest like a stone. For days afterward, she continued waking early out of habit, though there was no reason to. She would find herself standing near the stable, teapot in hand, staring at the empty space where Colton used to sit. Margaret noticed her mood and gently asked if something was troubling her, but Alara simply shook her head and said she was tired. 2 weeks passed. The estate remained in a strange state of limbo, waiting for news about the new Duke. Rumors swirled daily. Some said the heir had been found living abroad. Others claimed he was a distant relative who barely knew the family. The staff prepared for his arrival with a mixture of excitement and nervous energy, cleaning every corner of the manor, airing out rooms that had been closed for years, polishing silver that hadn't seen daylight in a decade. Alara worked through it all with a strange numbness, going through the motions of her duties while her mind kept drifting back to empty mornings, and a scarf she still wore despite the fading winter cold. On the day the carriage finally arrived, the entire staff gathered in the courtyard, lined up in their finest uniforms, ready to greet their new master. Margaret had scolded Alara for arriving late, rushing her out with a tray of tea meant for the welcoming ceremony, the same tray Alara had carried 1,000 times before without a second thought. She hadn't been paying attention to the carriage as it rolled to a stop. She had been focused on not spilling the tea, on keeping her hands steady, on getting through the ceremony so she could return to her normal duties. It was only when the murmurs of the staff around her grew louder, when Margaret gasped softly beside her, that Alara finally looked up. And there he was. Colton, except he wasn't wearing stable clothes anymore. He wore a coat of fine gray wool, tailored perfectly to his frame, boots polished to a shine, and on his hand, a signet ring that caught the morning light. His hair was neatly combed, his posture straight and commanding in a way she had never seen before. though something about his eyes, when they found hers across the courtyard, remained exactly the same. The tray in Alara's hands began to shake. Someone announced his full name, a name she had never heard him use, followed by a title that made the entire staff bow low. Duke of Ashcombe. Alara stood frozen, unable to bow, unable to move, unable to do anything but stare at the man she had brought tea to every single morning for almost a year. The man she had shared quiet secrets with in a cold stable. The man who had vanished without a word, now standing before her as the master of the very estate where she served. The teacup slipped from her trembling hand and shattered against the stone. Silence fell across the courtyard. Every eye turned toward her. Margaret's hand flew to her mouth in horror at the breach of etiquette. Alara felt her face burn with humiliation, but she couldn't look away from Colton's face, couldn't stop the storm of confusion and hurt and disbelief crashing through her chest all at once. Colton's eyes softened as he looked at her, and for a brief moment, in front of the entire staff, in front of the world that separated a duke from a kitchen maid, he took a single step toward her, as if the title on his shoulders meant nothing at all compared to the shattered cup at her feet. "Alara," he said quietly, his voice carrying across the stunned silence of the courtyard, "I owe you the truth." The courtyard remained frozen, dozens of eyes darting between the new duke and the trembling maid standing amid the shattered pieces of a teacup. Margaret Doyle stepped forward quickly, ready to pull Alara away and smooth over the disaster before it could grow worse. But Colton raised a hand, gentle yet firm, and the housekeeper stopped in her tracks. "Leave her," he said. "I will speak with her myself." A wave of whispers rippled through the staff. Nobody had ever heard of a duke addressing a kitchen maid directly, let alone in front of an entire assembly meant to welcome him into his new role. Walter Higgins, the head groundskeeper who had once told Alara that Colton had left for family matters, stood pale and stiff near the carriage, clearly realizing now what those family matters had actually been. Colton knelt down, ignoring the fine fabric of his new coat, and began gathering the broken pieces of porcelain from the stone ground. Alara watched him, still too stunned to speak, her mind racing through 100 questions at once. Why had he lied? Why had he lived among them, slept in a small room above a stable, mucked out stalls and mended bridles with his own 2 hands, when he could have simply arrived as a duke from the very beginning? "You should not be doing that," she finally managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. "Your Grace." The title felt strange and bitter on her tongue. Colton looked up at her, his expression pained. "Don't call me that, not you." "What else would you have me call you?" Alara said, and despite her attempt to keep her voice steady, it cracked with the weight of betrayal. "I don't even know your real name." "My name is still Colton," he said quietly, standing and holding the broken pieces of the cup carefully in his palm. "Colton Ashford. Colton was never a lie. Everything I told you about myself, everything I felt during those mornings, none of that was false." "Except the part where you were a stable hand," Alara said, her voice rising slightly before she caught herself, aware of the audience surrounding them. "Except the part where you let me believe we were equals." Margaret finally stepped in, her voice gentle but urgent. "Alara, perhaps this conversation should continue somewhere more private." Colton nodded in agreement, and before Alara could protest, he instructed the staff to return to their duties, promising a full address to the household later that evening. The courtyard slowly emptied, though not without lingering glances and hushed conversations trailing behind the departing workers. Alara felt the heat of embarrassment creeping up her neck, knowing that by nightfall, every servant in Ashcombe Manor would know her name, know her connection to the new duke, and speculate wildly about what it all meant. Colton led her to a small sitting room near the east wing, a room Alara had cleaned dozens of times but never had reason to enter as anything other than a maid. Now she stood in the center of it, feeling entirely out of place, while Colton closed the door behind them and set the broken teacup pieces gently on a side table, as though they were something precious rather than shattered rubbish. "Please sit," he said. "I would rather stand," Alara replied, crossing her arms. I think I deserve an explanation before I do anything else." Colton exhaled slowly, running a hand through his neatly combed hair, disturbing its careful arrangement in a way that reminded her, just for a moment, of the stable hand she used to know. "You deserve far more than an explanation, but I will give you what I can." He began to speak, and Alara listened, though every word felt like it was rearranging the foundation of everything she thought she understood about the past year of her life. Colton explained that he was, in fact, a distant cousin of the late Duke, raised not at Ashcombe, but at a smaller estate several days' travel from the manor. His father, a strict and controlling man, had spent years arranging a marriage for him with the daughter of a wealthy merchant family, a union meant to secure financial ties rather than any genuine affection between the two parties involved. Colton had resisted the arrangement for years, but his father refused to relent, insisting the marriage would happen the moment Colton came of proper age. "I did not want a life chosen entirely by someone else," Colton said, his voice low. "I did not want to marry a woman I had never truly spoken with, simply because our families believed it was profitable. So when my father passed unexpectedly, and I learned that the old Duke of Ashcombe, our family's closest surviving relation, was ailing and had no children of his own, I saw an opportunity." "An opportunity to hide," Alara said. "An opportunity to live, even for a short time, as myself," Colton corrected gently. "Away from expectations, away from titles, away from arrangements I never agreed to. I wrote to the old Duke, explained my situation, and he agreed to let me stay here quietly, working among the staff, learning the estate from the ground rather than descending upon it as a stranger with a title and no understanding of the people who kept it running. He believed, and I agreed, that a duke who understood his people would serve them far better than one who simply inherited power without earning any trust." Alara absorbed this slowly, her anger warring with a reluctant understanding. "So this entire time you were preparing to become duke. You knew, from the very first morning I brought you tea, that one day you would stand where you are standing now." "I knew it was possible," Colton admitted. "I did not know it would happen so soon. The old duke's health declined faster than any of us expected. I received word of his passing only days before you noticed the change in me. I did not leave because I wanted to. I was called away immediately by the family lawyers to handle matters of inheritance, matters that could not wait, matters I was forbidden from discussing with anyone at the estate until everything was legally settled." "You could have written to me," Alara said, her voice trembling now, no longer from anger but from something closer to grief. "You could have sent even a single line telling me you were safe, telling me there was a reason for your silence." Colton's jaw tightened, guilt evident in every line of his face. "I wanted to. I wrote perhaps a dozen letters to you and tore up every single one, because I did not know how to explain any of this without causing exactly the kind of pain I am causing you now. I told myself it would be easier to simply return and explain everything in person, but I see now that decision only made things worse." Alara turned away from him, walking toward the window, staring out at the courtyard where, just moments ago, the entire household had watched her drop a teacup in shock. She thought about all those mornings, the quiet conversations, the handmade scarf she still wore some days out of habit rather than necessity. None of it had been what she believed it to be, or perhaps all of it had been real, but shaped by a truth she had never been allowed to see. "What do you want from me now?" she asked quietly, not turning to face him. "Now that everyone knows my name, now that everyone will whisper about the maid who used to bring tea to the Duke when he was pretending to be a stable hand." Colton was silent for a long moment before answering. "I do not want anything from you that you are not willing to give, but I want you to know that the mornings we shared were the only part of my life these past months that felt honest. Everything else, the title, the inheritance, the expectations waiting for me here, all of it feels heavy and unfamiliar. You never treated me any differently once I told you I had no family, no fortune to speak of. You brought me tea because you thought I was cold and alone, not because you wanted anything in return." "That was true," Alara said softly. "I never wanted anything in return." "I know," Colton said. That is exactly why those mornings meant more to me than anything waiting for me in this house. Alara finally turned to face him, her eyes glistening but her voice steady. And now what? You are a duke, and I am a kitchen maid. The mornings we shared cannot continue the way they used to. You cannot simply invite me to the stable for tea anymore, not with the entire estate watching your every move. I know that too, Colton admitted. I do not have an answer for what comes next. I only know that I could not let you walk away from that courtyard, believing I had lied to you about who I truly am as a person. The title changes what people expect from me. It does not change what I feel. Alara did not know how to respond to that. Her heart, still raw from weeks of confusion and loss, wanted desperately to believe him, but her mind reminded her of the vast, unbridgeable gap that now stood between a duke and a maid. A gap that had not existed when she believed him to be nothing more than a quiet, stable hand with mysterious manners. Before she could find the words to answer, a sharp knock interrupted them, and the door opened to reveal a woman Alara had never seen before, dressed in an elegant traveling gown, her expression sharp and assessing as her eyes moved between Colton and Alara standing close together in the small sitting room. "Cousin Colton," the woman said smoothly, though her eyes lingered coldly on Alara's simple maid's uniform. "I did not realize you had already settled into your new role so intimately with the household staff." Colton's expression shifted immediately, the warmth in his eyes replaced by a guarded formality. "Cousin Beatrice. I was not expecting you so soon." "Clearly," Beatrice said, stepping into the room with the confidence of someone who had walked these halls long before Colton ever arrived. "I came the moment I heard the news of your inheritance. After all, someone in this family needs to ensure the estate is managed properly, especially given your rather unconventional preparation for the role." Alara felt the weight of the woman's gaze and without another word excused herself quickly, slipping past Beatrice and out into the corridor, her heart pounding with a mixture of emotions she could not begin to untangle. Behind her, she heard the low murmur of Colton and Beatrice's voices continuing, though she did not stay to listen. As she hurried back toward the kitchens, Alara realized that whatever storm had just begun with the arrival of the new duke, it was far from settled. And judging by the calculating look in Beatrice's eyes, the challenges facing Colton, and by extension, Alara herself, had only just begun. News of the confrontation in the courtyard spread through Ashcombe Manor faster than any fire could have. By the time Alara returned to the kitchens, the other maids had already heard 3 different versions of the story, each one more exaggerated than the last. Some claimed the Duke had proposed to her on the spot. Others whispered that she had been secretly engaged to him for months and had only just been revealed. Alara said nothing to correct any of it, choosing instead to bury herself in work, scrubbing pots with more force than necessary, while her mind replayed every word Colton had spoken in that small sitting room. Margaret found her an hour later, still scrubbing the same pot long after it had been cleaned. The older woman gently took the pot from her hands and set it aside, guiding Alara to sit at the small table in the corner of the kitchen where the staff took their brief meals. "You look like you have seen a ghost," Margaret said, pouring a cup of plain water and setting it in front of her. "I feel like I have," Alara admitted. "Everything I believed about the past year has been turned upside down." Margaret's expression softened with understanding rather than judgment. "I suspected something was different about that stable hand from the very beginning. No common worker holds a teacup the way he did, or speaks with such careful words, but I never imagined he was the heir to this entire estate." "Neither did I," Alara said. "And now his cousin has arrived, and I do not think she is pleased about anything she has seen since stepping through the gates." Margaret's brow furrowed. "Lady Beatrice. Yes, I have heard of her. Her family has long resented that the old duke never named her father as his heir, despite their closer relation by marriage. If she has come so quickly, it is not out of concern for her cousin's well-being. It is because she intends to challenge his claim to the title, or at the very least, control it from behind the scenes." Alara considered this, What does that mean for the estate, for all of us? It means we should all be very careful, Margaret said gravely, about what we say and to whom we say it. That evening, as promised, Colton addressed the full household in the great hall, standing at the head of a long table where the old Duke had once dined alone for decades. Alara stood among the kitchen staff near the back of the room, watching as Colton spoke with a calm authority that surprised her, given how uncertain he had seemed in their private conversation earlier that day. He spoke of continuity, promising that no long-serving member of the household would lose their position under his management. He spoke of fair wages, improved conditions for the stable workers who had once been his own colleagues, and a commitment to running the estate with honesty rather than the isolation the old Duke had practiced. The staff listened with cautious hope, many of them exchanging surprised glances at the promises being made. Lady Beatrice stood near the front of the hall throughout the address, her expression carefully neutral, though Alara noticed the tight set of her jaw whenever Colton spoke of the staff with genuine warmth rather than distant formality. After the address concluded and the staff began filing out to return to their duties, Beatrice approached Colton with a smile that did not reach her eyes. A rather sentimental speech, cousin. One might think you were trying to win the affection of servants rather than manage an estate. Perhaps winning their trust is exactly how one properly manages an estate, Colton replied evenly. How refreshingly modern, Beatrice said, her tone dripping with condescension. Though I wonder how such sentimentality will hold up when the estate's finances require difficult decisions, decisions that sentimental dukes often struggle to make. I will manage the finances of Ashcombe as I see fit, Colton said, his voice firm. You are welcome to stay as a guest, Beatrice, but do not mistake my hospitality for an invitation to interfere in matters that are no longer your concern. Beatrice's smile thinned, but she said nothing further, gliding away toward the guest wing with the practiced grace of someone accustomed to getting exactly what she wanted, eventually. Over the following days, life at Ashcombe Manor fell into an uneasy new rhythm. Colton immersed himself in the demands of his new position, meeting with estate managers, reviewing ledgers, and touring the vast property he now controlled. Alara continued her duties in the kitchen, though the easy comfort of her old routine had been replaced with a constant awareness of Colton's presence somewhere in the house, and the whispers that followed her whenever she passed through the halls. She did not see him for nearly a week after his address to the household. She told herself this was for the best. A duke had far more important matters to attend to than a kitchen maid he used to share tea with, and she needed time to steady her own heart, to remind herself of the impossible distance now separating them. But steadying her heart proved more difficult than she expected. She found herself glancing toward the stable during her rare free moments, remembering the quiet mornings that now felt like they belonged to a different lifetime. She missed him, plainly and painfully, in a way she had not allowed herself to admit even when he had first disappeared. It was Beatrice, unexpectedly, who disrupted the fragile peace that had settled over the manor. Alara was carrying a stack of freshly pressed linens toward the guest wing when Beatrice intercepted her in the corridor, blocking her path with an air of casual menace. You are the maid, Beatrice said, though it was not a question, the one who caused such a scene in the courtyard. I am sorry for the disruption, my lady, Alara said carefully, keeping her eyes lowered in proper deference. Do not apologize to me, Beatrice said, circling Alara slowly. Apologize to yourself for believing even for a moment that a duke's fondness for a common maid could ever amount to anything real. Men like Colton play at simplicity when it suits them, but they always return to their proper place eventually. And their proper place, my dear, does not include kitchen girls who once served them tea in a stable. Alara's cheeks burned, but she kept her composure, refusing to give Beatrice the satisfaction of a visible reaction. I have no expectations regarding his grace, my lady. I am simply a member of his household staff, nothing more. See that it stays that way, Beatrice said, her voice sharpening. Because if I discover that you are encouraging any inappropriate attachment from my cousin, attachment that could embarrass this family or complicate matters of inheritance. I will ensure your position here becomes far less secure than it currently is." The threat hung heavy in the air between them. Alara said nothing further, simply nodding once before continuing down the corridor with the linen still clutched tightly in her arms, her heart pounding with a mixture of anger and fear she had not expected to feel on what should have been an ordinary afternoon. She did not tell Margaret about the encounter, not wanting to cause any additional worry, but the threat lingered in her mind for the rest of the day, coloring every task with a new layer of anxiety. That night, unable to sleep, Alara found herself wandering out to the stable, drawn by habit and memory rather than any conscious decision. The building stood quiet and dark, the horses shifting softly in their stalls, the space that had once held so much warmth now feeling hollow and abandoned. She sat on the same overturned crate where Colton used to sit, running her fingers along the worn wood, remembering the countless mornings they had shared in this exact spot. She did not notice the soft footsteps approaching until a familiar voice broke the silence. "I did not expect to find you here." Alara turned quickly to find Colton standing in the doorway, dressed simply in a plain shirt and trousers rather than his fine Duke's clothing, looking, for a brief moment, exactly like the stable hand she had first met almost a year ago. "I could not sleep," Alara admitted. "I suppose old habits are difficult to break." Colton stepped inside, closing the distance between them slowly, as though giving her every opportunity to ask him to stop. "May I sit with you?" Alara hesitated only a moment before nodding, and Colton lowered himself onto the crate beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him in the cool night air. They sat in silence for a long while, neither one certain how to bridge the strange new distance that had grown between them despite their physical closeness. Finally, Alara spoke. "Your cousin paid me a visit this afternoon." Colton's posture stiffened immediately. "What did she say to you?" Alara relayed the conversation carefully, watching Colton's expression darken with each word. By the time she finished, his jaw was tight with barely restrained anger. "She had no right to threaten you," he said. "I will speak with her immediately." "Please do not," Alara said quickly, placing a hand on his arm without thinking, then withdrawing it just as fast, suddenly aware of the intimacy of the gesture. "It will only make things worse. She is already looking for reasons to undermine your position here. Do not give her a personal reason to target me specifically." Colton studied her carefully in the dim light. "You are trying to protect me, even now, even after everything I put you through." "I am trying to protect both of us," Alara said honestly. "Because whatever this is between us, Colton, it cannot exist in a world where your cousin is searching for any weakness to exploit. She wants your title. She will use anything, including me, to take it from you if given the chance." Colton was quiet for a long moment, his eyes searching hers in the darkness. "Do you believe there is still something between us, after everything?" Alara's breath caught in her throat. She thought about denying it, about protecting her own heart by insisting the distance between them was too vast to overcome. But sitting here, in the same stable where their friendship had first blossomed, she found she could not bring herself to lie. "I believe," she said slowly, "that I have missed you every single morning since you disappeared. I believe that despite every reason I have to be angry with you, despite every warning telling me this can never work, my heart has not changed at all regarding how I feel about you." Colton exhaled slowly, relief and something warmer flooding his expression. "Then we will find a way through this together. I do not know exactly how, not yet, not with Beatrice circling and the estate's future still uncertain. But I refuse to let a title separate me from the one person who has ever known me honestly, without pretense or expectation." Alara wanted desperately to believe him, but a nagging fear remained in the back of her mind, a fear that Beatrice's threats were not idle words, and that whatever challenges lay ahead would test both their resolve and their feelings in ways neither of them could yet predict. As if summoned by her very thoughts, a shadow shifted near the stable entrance, and both Alara and Colton turned sharply to find Walter Higgins standing there, his expression unreadable in the moonlight. "Your Grace," Walter said carefully, "forgive the intrusion, but there is a matter requiring your immediate attention. Lady Beatrice has summoned the estate lawyers to the manor. She claims to have discovered irregularities in the late Duke's will that she believes should be investigated before your inheritance is formally finalized." Colton's expression hardened instantly, all traces of the softness from moments ago replaced by cold determination. He rose from the crate, offering Alara a brief, apologetic glance before turning to follow Walter back toward the manor. Alara remained behind in the stable, her heart heavy with worry, watching the two figures disappear into the darkness, knowing that whatever storm Beatrice was brewing, it was about to test everything Colton had worked to build, and everything fragile and precious that had just begun to rebuild between the two of them. The great hall, which only nights before had held Colton's hopeful address to the household staff, now held a far tenser gathering. Two lawyers from the city sat at the long table, their leather cases open and papers spread before them, while Beatrice stood near the fireplace with the satisfied expression of someone who believed victory was already within reach. Colton entered with Walter close behind him, his face composed despite the late hour and the unexpected nature of the summons. "This had better be a matter of genuine urgency, Beatrice," Colton said, taking a seat across from the lawyers. "It is nearly midnight. I assure you, cousin, urgency is exactly what this matter demands," Beatrice replied smoothly, settling into a chair with the ease of someone who had rehearsed this moment carefully. "One of these gentlemen, Mr. Grayson, has uncovered something troubling while reviewing the late Duke's final documents." The older of the two lawyers, a thin man with spectacles perched on the end of his nose, cleared his throat and began speaking in a careful, measured tone. "Your Grace, in the course of finalizing the inheritance paperwork, we discovered a codicil attached to the late Duke's will, dated only a few months before his passing. This codicil suggests certain conditions regarding the transfer of the title that were not previously disclosed." Colton's brow furrowed. "What conditions?" The lawyer adjusted his spectacles nervously. "The codicil states that should the named heir fail to demonstrate, within 1 full year of assuming the title, sound and responsible management of the estate's affairs, the title and its associated properties may be contested and reviewed by a family council, of which Lady Beatrice's father is a senior member." A heavy silence fell over the room. Colton's expression remained carefully controlled, but Alara, who had quietly followed at a distance and now stood just outside the doorway unseen, could see the tension building in the set of his shoulders. "This is the first I am hearing of any such codicil," Colton said slowly. "Why was it not presented to me upon my arrival?" "It was only discovered this evening, Your Grace, during a more thorough review of the estate's legal documents," the lawyer explained. "Lady Beatrice requested this review upon her arrival, citing concerns about the thoroughness of the initial inheritance process." Colton turned his gaze toward Beatrice, understanding dawning clearly across his features. "You requested this review the moment you arrived, before you had even seen how I intended to manage the estate." Beatrice shrugged elegantly, unbothered by the accusation. "I simply wanted to ensure everything was in proper legal order, cousin. Surely you cannot fault me for exercising diligence regarding our family's legacy. You wanted a mechanism to remove me from this position the moment I make a single misstep," Colton said flatly. "This codicil is not concerned for the family legacy. It is a weapon you intend to use against me." "That is a rather dramatic interpretation," Beatrice said, though the slight smile tugging at her lips suggested Colton's assessment was not far from the truth. "Regardless of intention, the codicil is legally binding. You have 1 year to prove yourself capable of managing Ashcombe responsibly, or the family council will have every right to reconsider your inheritance." The second lawyer, younger and visibly uncomfortable with the tension in the room, spoke up hesitantly. "I should note, Your Grace, that the codicil does appear to bear the late Duke's authentic signature and seal, We have verified its legitimacy through standard means. Whatever Lady Beatrice's motivations for bringing it forward, the document itself is not fraudulent. Colton absorbed this information silently for a long moment before nodding. Very well. If this is indeed a legitimate condition set by the late Duke himself, then I will meet it. I have no intention of failing to manage this estate responsibly, and I have no fear of any council reviewing my conduct fairly. Beatrice's smile faltered slightly at his calm response, clearly having expected a more visible reaction of panic or frustration. We shall see, cousin. A year is a long time, and Ashcombe's affairs are more complicated than you may currently understand. The meeting concluded shortly afterward, the lawyers gathering their papers and retiring to guest rooms prepared for their overnight stay before their return journey the following morning. Beatrice swept out of the hall with a final triumphant glance toward Colton, leaving him alone with Walter in the flickering candlelight. "This changes things considerably, Your Grace," Walter said quietly. "It does," Colton agreed, rubbing his temples wearily. "Beatrice will be watching my every decision for the next year, searching for any excuse to bring this codicil before the family council. I cannot afford a single significant mistake." Alara, still standing just beyond the doorway, felt a fresh wave of anxiety wash over her. She understood immediately what this meant, not just for Colton's future, but for anything that might exist between them. If Beatrice was searching for reasons to discredit Colton's management of the estate, an inappropriate attachment to a kitchen maid would provide exactly the kind of ammunition she needed. She slipped away quietly before either man noticed her presence, returning to her small room near the kitchens with her mind racing. She lay awake most of the night, turning the situation over and over, searching for some solution that would not require sacrificing either Colton's inheritance or the fragile connection they had rebuilt in the stable. By morning, exhaustion weighed heavily on her, but she rose at her usual hour, determined to maintain her normal routine despite the storm brewing around her. She threw herself into her duties with renewed focus, hoping the familiar rhythm of kitchen work might quiet the anxious thoughts swirling through her mind. Word of the codicil spread quickly through the household staff, though the details remained murky and exaggerated as they passed from person to person. Some staff members worried openly about their own job security should the family council eventually side with Beatrice's father. Others expressed quiet support for Colton, having witnessed firsthand his genuine efforts to improve conditions for the workers during his brief time managing the estate. Margaret, ever perceptive, noticed Alara's exhaustion and drew her aside during a rare quiet moment in the kitchen. "You look as though you have not slept at all," Margaret observed, concern evident in her voice. "There is a great deal happening that I do not fully understand," Alara admitted, keeping her voice low. "And I fear that whatever affection exists between myself and His Grace may become a liability for him, at exactly the moment he can least afford one." Margaret considered this carefully before responding. "Alara, I have watched you grow from a grieving young girl into a capable young woman over these past 6 years. I have also watched the way that young man looks at you, both when he was a stable hand and now as a duke. That kind of feeling does not simply disappear because circumstances become complicated, but you are right to be cautious. Perhaps the wisest course for now is patience. Let him prove himself capable of managing this estate on his own merits, without additional distractions or complications. If what exists between you is genuine, it will still be there once the immediate danger has passed." Alara appreciated the advice, though patience felt like a difficult virtue to practice when her heart ached with every reminder of the growing distance between herself and Colton. Over the following weeks, Colton threw himself into estate management with a focus and dedication that impressed even the most skeptical members of the household staff. He personally reviewed every ledger, met with tenant farmers to discuss fair rent adjustments, and implemented several improvements to working conditions that had been neglected under the old Duke's isolated reign. He handled each decision with careful deliberation, clearly aware that Beatrice was watching closely, searching for any misstep to report back to the family council. Alara watched his transformation from a cautious distance, proud of his efforts despite the ache of separation that had settled between them. They exchanged only brief, formal greetings when their paths crossed in the halls, both of them acutely aware of Beatrice's watchful presence lurking somewhere nearby, ready to seize upon any evidence of impropriety. It was during one such brief encounter, nearly a month after the codicil's revelation, that everything began to change once again. Alara was delivering a tray of refreshments to the study where Colton had been working late into the evening, reviewing tenant contracts by candlelight. She knocked softly, and upon receiving permission to enter, found him slumped wearily over a mountain of papers, dark circles evident beneath his eyes. "You should rest, Your Grace," she said carefully, setting the tray down on the corner of his desk. Colton looked up at her, and despite the exhaustion evident in his features, a warm smile broke through. "It has been far too long since I heard you call me anything other than Your Grace." "It seemed appropriate, given the circumstances," Alara said, though she found herself lingering near the desk longer than her duties strictly required. "The circumstances have kept us apart for weeks," Colton said quietly, setting down his pen. "I have missed our mornings more than I can properly express." "I have missed them too," Alara admitted, her carefully maintained distance wavering. "But I fear allowing ourselves any closeness right now would only give Beatrice exactly the weapon she is searching for." Colton nodded slowly, understanding the wisdom in her caution even as frustration flickered across his features. "I know, I hate it, but I know you are right. I simply wonder how much longer I can continue pretending that my feelings for you have not grown stronger, not weaker, despite every reason circumstance has given me to distance myself." Alara's heart ached at his words, mirroring exactly the same struggle within her own chest. Before she could respond, however, a sound from the hallway outside the study caught her attention, the distinct click of footsteps pausing just beyond the door, followed by silence that felt far too deliberate to be accidental. Her eyes met Colton's, both of them recognizing the same suspicion at once. Someone had been listening. Colton moved quickly, crossing the room in a few long strides and pulling the study door open to find the corridor empty, though a faint trace of perfume lingered in the air, a scent Alara recognized immediately as belonging to Beatrice. "She heard everything," Alara said, her stomach twisting with dread. "Perhaps not everything," Colton said, though his tone lacked conviction, "but enough certainly to cause trouble." They did not have long to wait to discover the extent of the damage. The very next morning, before Alara had even finished preparing breakfast for the household, Margaret pulled her aside with an urgent expression. "Lady Beatrice has requested that you be brought before her in the drawing room immediately," Margaret said, worry etched across her features. "She specifically asked for you by name, Alara, and no one else." Alara's heart sank, but she straightened her apron and followed Margaret's instructions, walking toward the drawing room with as much composure as she could manage despite the anxiety churning in her stomach. Beatrice was waiting when Alara arrived, seated elegantly in a high-backed chair near the window, a cup of tea resting untouched on the small table beside her. Her expression, when she looked up at Alara's entrance, held none of the veiled threats from their previous encounter. This time, the hostility was open and unmistakable. "I overheard a rather illuminating conversation last night," Beatrice said without preamble, "between yourself and my cousin in his private study, at an hour no maid should have any business remaining alone with her employer." "I was delivering refreshments, my lady," Alara said carefully, keeping her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her, "as I have done many evenings when His Grace works late." "Do not insult my intelligence," Beatrice snapped, rising from her chair. "I heard him speak of feelings, of morning's mist, of a closeness that extends far beyond the appropriate relationship between a duke and his household staff. I warned you once already about the consequences of encouraging such inappropriate attachment." "I have encouraged nothing, my lady," Alara said, though her voice trembled slightly. Whatever feelings exist between His Grace and myself developed long before either of us understood his true position in this family. I have done everything within my power to maintain proper distance since learning the truth of who he is." "Clearly not enough distance," Beatrice said coldly. "I intend to report this incident to the family council immediately. A duke who cannot maintain appropriate boundaries with his household staff, particularly during the critical first year of his inheritance, is a duke who demonstrates poor judgment. This will strengthen my father's case considerably when the council reviews Colton's conduct." Panic flooded through Alara at the realization of what was truly at stake. This was not simply about her own reputation or position within the household. Her presence, her very existence in Colton's life, had become a direct threat to his ability to keep the inheritance he had worked so hard to prove himself worthy of. "Please, my lady," Alara said, desperation creeping into her voice despite her efforts to remain composed. "Whatever punishment you believe I deserve, please do not let it affect His Grace's standing with the family council. He has worked tirelessly these past weeks to manage this estate responsibly. He does not deserve to lose everything because of a personal connection that predates his understanding of his own title." Beatrice studied her for a long moment, something calculating shifting behind her eyes. "There may be a way to avoid such an outcome," she said slowly. "If you were to remove yourself from Ashcombe Manor entirely, quietly, without drawing further attention to this matter, I would be willing to reconsider bringing it before the council. After all, if the source of temptation is no longer present, there can be no further concern about inappropriate attachment influencing my cousin's judgment." The proposal hit Alara like a physical blow. Leave Ashcombe. Leave the only home she had known since childhood, the position Margaret had given her when she had nowhere else to turn, and most painfully, leave Colton entirely, without explanation, without goodbye. "You want me to disappear," Alara said quietly. "I want you to make a sensible decision that protects my cousin's future," Beatrice replied. "Surely, if your feelings for him are as genuine as they appear, you would rather see him retain his position and his family's legacy than cling selfishly to a connection that endangers everything he has worked for." Alara felt tears threatening at the corners of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall in front of Beatrice. "I will consider your words carefully, my lady." "See that you do," Beatrice said, settling back into her chair and retrieving her cooled tea with an air of finality. "You have until the end of the week to make your decision." Alara left the drawing room in a daze, her mind spinning with the impossible choice now placed before her. She wandered aimless through the halls, barely registering her surroundings, until she found herself standing outside the kitchen, staring blankly at the familiar space that had been her entire world for 6 years. Margaret found her there a short while later, gently guiding her to a quiet corner where they could speak privately. "What did Lady Beatrice say to you?" Margaret asked softly. Alara relayed the conversation through halting words, her composure finally breaking as she reached the end, tears spilling freely down her cheeks. "She wants me gone, Margaret. She believes my presence here threatens Colton's inheritance, and she may be right. If the family council learns of our feelings for each other, it could give them exactly the justification they need to strip him of the title he has worked so hard to prove himself worthy of." Margaret held her gently, allowing her to cry for a long moment before speaking. "Alara, listen to me carefully. Lady Beatrice's threats are not concern for her cousin's well-being. They are manipulation, designed to remove any obstacle standing between herself and control of this estate. If you leave, do you truly believe she will simply drop the matter and leave Colton in peace? Or will she simply find another reason, another excuse, to bring before that council?" Alara considered this through her tears, recognizing the truth in Margaret's words even as fear continued to cloud her judgment. But what if she is telling the truth about the danger this poses to him? I could not bear to be the reason he loses everything. "Then perhaps," Margaret said gently, "the decision should not be yours to make alone. Colton deserves to know exactly what threat has been made against you and against him before any drastic decisions are reached. He is not a child who needs protecting from difficult truths, Alara. He is a grown man who has already proven, time and again, that he values honesty above comfortable pretense. Alara knew Margaret was right, though the thought of confronting Colton with this news, of potentially forcing him to choose between his inheritance and their fragile connection, filled her with dread. Still, she recognized that making such a significant decision without his knowledge would only compound the deception that had already caused so much pain between them. That evening, Alara sought out Colton after his usual work concluded, finding him once again in his study, though this time he was staring blankly at an unopened ledger rather than working through it with his usual focus. He looked up as she entered, and something in her expression must have alerted him immediately to the seriousness of the matter. "What has happened?" he asked, rising from his chair. Alara told him everything. Beatrice's ultimatum, the threat to bring their connection before the family council, the suggestion that Alara quietly leave the estate to protect his inheritance. She watched his expression shift from concern to anger and finally to a steady, resolute determination she had not expected. "She will not manipulate either of us into destroying something precious," Colton said firmly, once Alara finished her account. "I refuse to let Beatrice's schemes dictate the course of my life or yours." "But the codicil, Colton," Alara said, worry still evident in her voice. "If the council learns of our feelings, if they believe it demonstrates poor judgment on your part, then I will explain to the council, honestly and without shame, exactly what happened between us," Colton interrupted gently. "I will tell them that our friendship began before either of us understood the position I now hold, that it grew from genuine kindness and connection rather than any impropriety befitting a duke. If they cannot understand that a man's heart does not simply cease to feel because circumstances change, then perhaps they are not fit to judge my worthiness for this title in the first place." Alara felt a fragile hope kindling in her chest, despite her continued fear. "You would risk everything, your entire inheritance, for this." "I already told you, Alara, weeks ago in the stable," Colton said, stepping closer to her. "The mornings we shared were the only honest part of my life during my time preparing for this role. I will not sacrifice honesty now, when it matters most, simply to satisfy Beatrice's calculated ambitions." Before Alara could respond, a knock interrupted them, and Walter entered with an urgent expression, clearly having rushed from wherever he had been. "Your Grace, forgive the intrusion, but Lady Beatrice has just informed me she is departing for the city tonight, ahead of schedule. She claims she has urgent business requiring her immediate presence there." Colton's eyes narrowed with suspicion. What business could possibly require such an abrupt departure at this hour? Walter hesitated before answering. "I overheard her instructing her carriage driver to make haste toward the offices of the family council's lead solicitor. I believe, Your Grace, that she intends to bring formal accusations before the council far sooner than any of us anticipated." Colton wasted no time. Within the hour, he had ordered his own carriage prepared, determined to reach the city before Beatrice could plant her accusations too firmly in the minds of the family council. Alara stood in the courtyard as he prepared to depart, her heart heavy with worry, though she recognized this was a battle Colton needed to fight himself, in the proper venue, with proper representation, rather than through impulsive confrontation. "Whatever happens," Colton said, pausing before climbing into the carriage, "I want you to know that I do not regret a single moment of what we have shared. Not the tea, not the mornings, not any of it." "Please be careful," Alara said, her voice thick with emotion, "and please come back to us." Colton offered her a brief, determined smile before disappearing into the carriage, and Alara watched the vehicle rumble away into the darkness, her heart pounding with fear for what awaited him at the end of that journey. The following days passed in agonizing uncertainty for everyone remaining at Ashcombe Manor. Word filtered back slowly through occasional messages sent by Walter, who had accompanied Colton to the city, but the details remained frustratingly sparse. The family council, it seemed, had convened an emergency session to hear Beatrice's accusations, and the proceedings were expected to last several days given the gravity of the matter and the number of family members who needed to be consulted. Alara continued her duties throughout this period, though her mind remained constantly occupied with worry for Colton's fate. Margaret did her best to keep her distracted with additional responsibilities, but nothing could fully quiet the anxious thoughts churning beneath the surface. On the fourth day of Colton's absence, a letter arrived at the manor, addressed specifically to Alara in handwriting she recognized immediately as his own. She retreated to her small room to read it privately, her hands trembling as she broke the seal. The letter was brief but heartfelt, explaining that the council proceedings had proven more complicated than expected, as several family members had aligned themselves with Beatrice's father in hopes of gaining influence over the estate's considerable resources. Colton wrote that he had presented his case honestly, explaining the full history of his time at Ashcombe, including his genuine connection with Alara, without attempting to minimize or hide any aspect of the situation. He wrote that the council remained divided, with some members sympathetic to his transparent approach to estate management, while others viewed his relationship with a household maid as evidence of exactly the poor judgment the codicil had been designed to guard against. A final decision, he wrote, would be reached within the next 2 days, and he promised to send word immediately once the matter was resolved, regardless of the outcome. Alara read the letter several times, drawing what comfort she could from his words while bracing herself for whatever news might arrive next. She folded the letter carefully and tucked it into the same drawer where she kept the handmade scarf Colton had given her during those early winter mornings, a small collection of keepsakes representing everything precious and uncertain about their connection. 2 days later, as promised, another message arrived, though this time it came not as a letter but as an urgent summons delivered by a breathless young messenger who had ridden hard from the city. Walter had sent word that Colton required Alara's presence immediately, that the council had reached a decision that involved her directly, and that Colton believed her testimony might prove crucial to the final outcome. Margaret arranged for Alara to travel to the city immediately, providing her with a modest traveling dress and firm instructions to speak honestly and confidently before whatever gathering awaited her. The journey felt endless, Alara's mind racing through countless possibilities for what testimony could possibly be required of her, and what consequences might follow depending on what she chose to say. She arrived at the grand townhouse where the family council had convened just as evening settled over the city, and Walter met her at the entrance, his expression grave but not entirely without hope. "The council has reached a tentative conclusion," Walter explained as he led her through the ornate hallways, "but several members remain unconvinced that His Grace's judgment can be trusted, given his continued attachment to you. They have requested to hear directly from you, to assess for themselves whether this connection represents a genuine impropriety or something more substantial." Alara's stomach twisted with nerves as Walter led her into a formal meeting room where a long table hosted perhaps a dozen distinguished family members, along with Colton, seated at one end, and Beatrice, seated pointedly at the other. Colton's eyes met Alara's the moment she entered, relief and concern mingling in his expression, though he made no move to approach her, clearly understanding the formal nature of the proceedings. An older gentleman, introduced as the head of the family council, gestured for Alara to take a seat at the center of the table, facing the assembled relatives. "Miss Whitmore," the council head began, his tone measured and not unkind, "we understand you have served at Ashcombe Manor for several years, and that you developed a personal connection with the current Duke prior to his assumption of the title. We would like to understand, in your own words, the nature of this connection, and whether you believe it has, at any point, compromised his judgment or ability to manage the estate responsibly." Alara took a steadying breath, glancing briefly toward Colton before addressing the council directly. "My connection with His Grace began nearly a year ago, when he arrived at Ashcombe Manor working as a stable hand, though I did not know at the time that he was anything other than what he appeared to be. I began bringing him tea each morning out of simple kindness, noticing that he worked long hours in difficult conditions without complaint. Over the following months, our friendship grew through countless small conversations, none of which, I assure you, ever crossed into impropriety of any kind. She continued, describing the honesty and care that had characterized their relationship from the very beginning. The way Colton had never once used his hidden position to gain any advantage or expectation from her, and the genuine shock she had experienced upon discovering his true identity at his arrival ceremony. I understand the concern regarding whether personal feelings might compromise sound judgment, Alara continued, her voice growing steadier with each word. But I would ask the council to consider this. Since learning of his true position, His Grace has worked tirelessly to prove himself capable of managing this estate with fairness and integrity, exactly as he promised the household staff during his very first address. He has improved conditions for tenant farmers, ensured fair wages for workers who had long been neglected, and personally reviewed every significant decision affecting this estate's future. None of this work has been compromised by our friendship. If anything, I believe his time spent living among the staff, understanding their struggles firsthand, has made him a more capable and compassionate leader than he might otherwise have been. A murmur passed through the assembled council members, several exchanging thoughtful glances at her words. Beatrice, seated at the far end of the table, shifted uncomfortably, clearly not having anticipated such a composed and articulate defense from a simple kitchen maid. The council head considered Alara's words carefully before speaking again. Miss Whitmore, one final question. If the council were to determine that this connection must end entirely, for the sake of preserving the Duke's position and reputation, would you be willing to accept such a decision, regardless of your personal feelings on the matter? The question hung heavy in the room, and Alara felt every eye turned toward her, waiting for her response. She glanced once more toward Colton, seeing the pain evident in his expression at the mere suggestion of such an outcome, before turning back to address the council directly. "I love him," Alara said simply, the words emerging with a clarity that surprised even herself. "I will not pretend otherwise, not even to satisfy this council's expectations. But I also love this estate, and the people who depend on it for their livelihoods, and I understand that His Grace's ability to protect and provide for them matters far more than my own personal happiness. If the council believes, truly and honestly, that our connection endangers his ability to fulfill that responsibility, then I will step aside, painful as that would be. But I do not believe that is the case, and I would ask the council to judge him based on his actions and decisions as Duke, rather than dismissing his character based solely on who he chooses to love." Silence fell over the room following her declaration. Colton's eyes glistened with emotion, clearly moved by her words, while several council members exchanged impressed glances at the maturity and selflessness of her response. The council head nodded slowly, gathering his papers before addressing the room. "The council will deliberate privately and reach a final decision within the hour. Miss Whitmore, Your Grace, please remain available should further questions arise." As the council members filed out to a private chamber to deliberate, Colton finally crossed the room to stand beside Alara, taking her hand gently in his own despite the formal setting. "That was the bravest thing I have ever witnessed," he said quietly. "I only spoke the truth," Alara replied, though her hands trembled slightly with the aftermath of nerves. "Whatever they decide now, I could not have lived with myself if I had allowed fear to keep me silent." Beatrice, remaining at the far end of the table, watched their quiet exchange with an expression Alara could not quite read. Something caught between frustration and, unexpectedly, a flicker of grudging respect. The hour that followed felt like the longest of Alara's life, as she and Colton waited together in a small antechamber, saying little, simply grateful for each other's presence during the uncertain wait. Finally, a servant arrived to summon them back to the main meeting room, where the assembled council members had reconvened, their expressions giving little indication of what conclusion they had reached. The council head rose to address them both directly, his tone formal but carrying an unmistakable note of resolution. After careful deliberation, he began, the council has reached its decision regarding the matters brought before us today. The room seemed to hold its collective breath as the council head continued, his measured voice carrying clearly to every corner of the chamber. The council finds no evidence that the Duke's personal connection with Miss Whitmore has, at any point, compromised his management of the Ashcombe estate, he announced. To the contrary, several members of this council have noted that his approach to leadership, one grounded in genuine understanding of the household staff and tenant workers, appears to be producing measurable improvements across the estate's operations. The codicil requiring demonstration of sound management within 1 year remains in effect, and the council will continue monitoring the Duke's performance as originally intended. However, we find no grounds to consider his personal relationships, provided they are conducted honorably, as evidence of poor judgment warranting early intervention. A wave of relief washed over Alara so powerfully that she felt momentarily lightheaded, gripping Colton's hand tighter as the council head continued. Furthermore, he said, turning his gaze pointedly toward Beatrice, the council wishes to address the manner in which these accusations were brought forward. Several members have expressed concern that this matter was pursued with undue haste and apparent personal motivation, rather than genuine concern for the estate's well-being. While we do not doubt Lady Beatrice's right to raise legitimate concerns regarding family matters, we would remind all members of this family that the codicil exists to protect Ashcombe's interests, not to serve as a tool for personal ambition. Beatrice's face flushed with barely concealed anger at the rebuke, though she said nothing, recognizing that any further protest would only damage her standing further among the assembled relatives. "This council session is concluded," the head announced, rising from his seat. "Your Grace, Miss Whitmore, you are free to return to Ashcombe. We wish you continued success in the responsibilities before you." The relief that flooded through Alara felt almost overwhelming as the council members began filing out of the room, several pausing to offer brief words of encouragement to Colton as they departed. Beatrice remained seated for a long moment after the others had left, her expression unreadable, before finally rising and approaching where Colton and Alara stood together. "I suppose congratulations are in order," Beatrice said stiffly, though something in her tone had shifted from its earlier hostility. "You have proven more capable than I expected, cousin, both in managing the estate and in choosing your companions." "Thank you, Beatrice," Colton said carefully, watching his cousin with cautious surprise at the apparent shift in her demeanor. "Do not misunderstand me," Beatrice added quickly, some of her familiar sharpness returning. "I still believe you would benefit from more experienced guidance in certain financial matters, and I intend to remain involved in overseeing the estate's affairs as the council directed. But I will admit, Miss Whitmore's words today demonstrated a character and loyalty that I did not expect to find in a common maid. Perhaps I underestimated both of you." It was not quite an apology, but Alara recognized it as close to one as Beatrice was likely to offer, and she nodded politely in acknowledgement. "Thank you, my lady." Beatrice departed shortly afterward, leaving Colton and Alara alone in the now empty meeting room, the weight of the past several days finally beginning to lift from their shoulders. "We should return to Ashcombe as soon as possible," Colton said, though his voice carried a lightness that had been absent throughout the difficult journey to the city. "There is a great deal of work still ahead of us, but for the first time since my arrival, I feel as though the path forward is genuinely clear." The journey back to Ashcombe Manor felt entirely different from the anxious carriage ride that had carried Colton away days earlier. Alara sat beside him this time, the formal distance that had characterized their public interactions for weeks finally beginning to soften, replaced by an easy comfort reminiscent of their early morning conversations in the stable. "I have been thinking," Colton said as the countryside rolled past the carriage windows, "about what you said before the council, about loving this estate and its people as much as you claim to love me." Every word of it was true, Alara said softly. I believe you, Colton said. And it made me realize something important. You understand this estate and its people in ways that I am still learning. You grew up among them. You know their struggles, their hopes, their daily lives, in a way that no amount of ledgers or formal reports could ever teach me. If I am to be the kind of duke who truly serves Ashcombe well, I suspect I will need that understanding beside me, not merely as a fond memory of mornings past, but as an ongoing partnership. Alara felt her heart quicken at his words, though she remained cautious about reading too much into them. What are you suggesting, Colton? I am not entirely certain yet, he admitted with a small, honest smile. Only that I do not intend to let fear of scandal, or the opinions of distant relatives, dictate the shape of my future any longer. I spent too many years allowing my father to arrange my life according to his own ambitions. I do not intend to spend the rest of it allowing Beatrice, or anyone else, to do the same. They arrived back at Ashcombe Manor to find the household staff anxiously awaiting news of the council's decision, having heard only fragmented rumors during Colton's absence. Margaret rushed forward the moment the carriage door opened, relief evident on her face as she took in Alara's composed, if tired, expression. The council has ruled in favor of continuing the arrangement as it stands, Colton announced to the assembled staff, his voice carrying clearly across the courtyard. Ashcombe Manor will continue under my management, and I intend to continue the improvements we have already begun implementing together. A cheer rose from the gathered workers, genuine warmth and relief evident in their reaction, a stark contrast to the nervous energy that had characterized the household in the weeks since the codicil's revelation. Over the following weeks, life at Ashcombe Manor settled into a new and more hopeful rhythm. Colton continued his diligent management of the estate, though he no longer felt the need to maintain such careful distance from Alara in his daily interactions. Their friendship, tested and strengthened by the trials they had faced together, began to blossom openly, no longer confined to secret morning meetings in a cold stable. The household staff, having witnessed Alara's brave testimony before the family council through the stories Walter shared upon their return, treated her with a newfound respect that had little to do with any romantic connection to the Duke, and everything to do with the courage she had displayed in defending both her own convictions and the man she loved. Still, Alara found herself wrestling with lingering uncertainty about what the future might hold. The council's approval addressed the immediate threat to Colton's inheritance, but the fundamental gap between a duke and a kitchen maid remained a reality neither of them had yet fully addressed. She voiced this concern to Margaret one evening, as they sat together folding linens in the quiet kitchen. I do not know what comes next for us, Alara admitted. The council may have ruled that our friendship does not threaten his inheritance, but that does not mean society will simply accept a duke choosing to build a life alongside someone born into service. Margaret considered this thoughtfully before responding. Alara, I have lived long enough to understand that society's expectations often shift far more readily than we assume, particularly when a man of Colton's position demonstrates enough conviction and courage in his choices. But more importantly, I have watched you grow into a woman capable of facing far greater challenges than the opinions of distant strangers. Whatever decision Colton makes regarding your future together, I have no doubt you will face it with the same courage you displayed before that council. That evening, as the last light of day faded over the hills surrounding Ashcombe Manor, Alara found herself once again drawn toward the familiar comfort of the stable, though this time she did not carry a teapot, having no specific errand or habit drawing her there beyond a simple desire for quiet reflection. She found Colton already there, seated on the same overturned crate where their friendship had first begun, staring thoughtfully at the same worn tools he had once used during his time as a stable hand. I find myself returning here often, he admitted as she approached, even though I have no practical reason to do so anymore. There is something about this place that feels more honest than the grand halls of the manor. I understand completely, Alara said, settling beside him in the familiar spot. It was here that I first learned who you truly were, long before I understood your title or your inheritance." Colton turned to face her, something resolute and tender shining in his eyes in the dim evening light. "Elara, I have spent these past weeks proving to a council of distant relatives that I am capable of managing an estate responsibly. But there is one decision remaining that matters far more to me than anything they could ever approve or deny." Elara's breath caught as she watched him rise from the crate, kneeling before her with a sincerity that erased every remaining doubt lingering in her heart. "I do not care what society expects of a duke," Colton said softly. "I care only about building a life with the one person who has ever known me honestly, who loved me long before she understood the weight of the title I now carry, and who proved before an entire council that her heart holds more courage and conviction than most of the nobility I have encountered since arriving at this estate." Elara's hands trembled as Colton reached into his coat and produced a small ring, simple in design but clearly crafted with care, nothing like the ostentatious jewelry she had glimpsed among the wealthy guests who occasionally visited the manor. "I had this made using the last of the wages I earned as a stable hand," he explained, his voice carrying a vulnerable honesty that touched her deeply. "I wanted to give you something that came from the man you first knew, rather than the title that came later. Elara Whitmore, will you marry me, not because I am a duke, but because I love you, exactly as I did during those quiet mornings when neither of us knew what the future held?" Tears streamed freely down Elara's cheeks as she nodded, unable to find words adequate enough to express the overwhelming joy flooding through her heart. "Yes," she finally managed. "Yes, Colton, I will marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger with careful, trembling hands, and for a long moment they simply held each other in the quiet stable, the same space where their story had begun nearly a year ago, now witnessing its most important chapter yet. News of their engagement spread through Ashcombe Manor within hours, and unlike the shocked whispers that had followed Elara's dropped teacup months earlier, this time the household staff greeted the announcement with genuine celebration. Margaret wept openly with joy, embracing Elara as though she were celebrating the marriage of her own daughter, while even the more reserved members of the staff offered warm congratulations, having witnessed firsthand the genuine partnership that had grown between their duke and the kitchen maid who had once brought him tea. Not everyone received the news with equal enthusiasm. When word reached Beatrice, still involved in overseeing certain aspects of the estate's finances as the council had directed, her reaction was predictably measured with skepticism. "Marriage is a rather significant step, cousin," she said carefully during a visit shortly after the engagement announcement. "The council may have accepted your friendship with Miss Whitmore, but formalizing this connection through marriage will invite far greater scrutiny from society at large. Are you prepared for the whispers, the judgment, the doors that may close to you both as a result of this decision?" "I am prepared for whatever comes," Colton replied without hesitation. "I have already faced the possibility of losing my entire inheritance rather than sacrifice my connection with Elara. A few whispers from society hold considerably less weight in comparison." Beatrice studied him for a long moment before something that might almost have been respect flickered across her expression. "Very well. I will admit, I did not expect such conviction from you when you first arrived at Ashcombe, still smelling of stable hay and speaking with the careful manners of someone raised for a life you never wanted. Perhaps this unconventional path has served you better than the arrangement your father once intended." It was, Elara realized upon hearing of this exchange later, the closest thing to genuine acceptance Beatrice was likely to offer, and both she and Colton chose to receive it graciously rather than press for anything more. The wedding preparations that followed brought their own unique challenges, blending the traditions expected of a duke's marriage with the simpler sensibilities Elara had grown up with among the household staff. Colton insisted on incorporating elements meaningful to Elara's own background, including a small ceremony held in the very courtyard where he had first arrived as the new duke, rather than the grand cathedral typically reserved for noble weddings. Margaret took charge of many preparations with the enthusiasm of someone, finally able to celebrate joy after months of tension and uncertainty at the manor. She personally oversaw the selection of Alara's wedding dress, a beautiful but understated gown that honored Alara's roots while still befitting her new position as the future Duchess of Ashcombe. As the wedding day approached, Alara found herself reflecting often on the improbable journey that had led her to this moment. She thought of her mother, gone now for 6 years, and wondered what she might have thought of her daughter's unlikely path from grieving orphan to kitchen maid to the future wife of a duke. She thought of those early mornings in the cold stable, never imagining that simple kindness toward a stranger would grow into the deepest love of her life. The morning of the wedding arrived clear and bright, the kind of gentle sunshine that seemed to bless the occasion with quiet approval. Alara stood in her small room, now dressed in her wedding gown, staring at her reflection with a mixture of nervousness and overwhelming happiness. Margaret entered quietly, her eyes glistening with emotion at the sight of the young woman she had raised as her own. "Your mother would be so proud of you," she said softly, echoing the very thoughts that had occupied Alara's mind throughout the preparations. "Not because you are marrying a duke, but because of the woman you have become. Kind, brave, honest, exactly the qualities that drew him to you in the first place, and exactly the qualities that will make you a wonderful duchess to the people of this estate." The ceremony itself passed in a blur of joy and emotion. The household staff gathered as honored guests rather than mere servants, celebrating alongside the handful of family members who had chosen to attend, including, to everyone's surprise, Beatrice, who watched the proceedings with an expression that had softened considerably since the tense days following the codicil's revelation. When Colton and Alara exchanged their vows, standing in the very courtyard where their story had so dramatically shifted months earlier, Alara felt an overwhelming sense of completeness, as though every difficult moment of the past year, every fear and doubt and challenge, had led inevitably to this perfect union of two people who had found each other honestly, without pretense or expectation, and had fought together to preserve that honesty against every obstacle placed before them. As the ceremony concluded, and the celebration began in earnest, Alara found a quiet moment to slip away with Colton, the two of them standing together near the edge of the courtyard, watching the joyful chaos of their wedding celebration unfold before them. "Do you remember," Colton said softly, "the very first morning you brought me tea in that stable, when neither of us knew what the future held?" "I remember every detail," Alara replied, leaning her head against his shoulder. "The cold air, the way you thanked me so carefully, as though such a small kindness meant something significant to you." "It did mean something significant," Colton said, "more than you could have possibly known at the time. Those mornings gave me hope during a period when my entire future felt uncertain and imposed upon me by others. You gave me a glimpse of what an honest life, built on genuine connection rather than obligation, could actually look like." Alara smiled, watching the household staff dance and celebrate nearby, Margaret laughing warmly with several of the kitchen workers, even Beatrice offering a rare, genuine smile as she conversed with some of the estate's tenant farmers. "And now that honest life is truly ours to build together." "Ours," Colton agreed, "for as long as we both shall live." As the sun began to set over Ashcombe Manor that evening, casting warm golden light across the courtyard where their story had begun, and where their new life together now truly commenced, Alara understood with complete certainty that whatever challenges the future might still hold, she would face them with the same quiet courage that had carried her through the difficult months leading to this joyful day. She had brought tea to a stranger in a cold stable simply out of kindness, never imagining that small gesture would lead her to a love deep enough to weather scandal, threats, and the vast distance that had once seemed to separate their two worlds entirely. The stable boy had become a duke, but more importantly, the duke had never stopped being the honest, kind man she had fallen in love with during those quiet morning conversations. And that, Alara realized as she watched him laugh warmly with members of his household staff who had once been his own colleagues, was the truest measure of the man she had chosen to spend her life beside. A year passed since the wedding, and Ashcombe Manor had transformed in ways few could have predicted when Colton first arrived disguised as a humble stable hand. The estate's finances, once neglected under the old Duke's isolated management, now flourished under Colton's attentive leadership, guided always by the practical wisdom Alara offered from her years of understanding the daily realities faced by the household staff and tenant farmers alike. The family council, having monitored Colton's progress throughout the year required by the codicil, convened one final time to review his overall performance as Duke. This time, the proceedings carried none of the tension that had characterized their earlier meeting. Reports from tenant farmers spoke of fair treatment and improved harvests. Financial records showed steady growth rather than the stagnation that had plagued the estate for decades. Even Beatrice, when called upon to offer her assessment, spoke with grudging but genuine admiration of her cousin's transformation from uncertain heir to capable steward of the family legacy. The codicil's conditions were formally and permanently satisfied, removing any remaining threat to Colton's inheritance and allowing him and Alara to focus entirely on building their life together without the shadow of council scrutiny hanging over their daily decisions. Life within the walls of Ashcombe Manor had changed in countless small ways since Alara's transition from kitchen maid to duchess. She insisted on maintaining certain traditions from her earlier life, continuing to visit the kitchens regularly, not as an employer inspecting her staff, but as someone who genuinely valued the relationships built during her years working alongside them. Margaret, now serving as the estate's most trusted advisor on household matters, often joked that Alara remained the only duchess in the region who still knew how to properly knead bread dough or calm a temperamental oven. The morning tea ritual that had started their entire story continued as well, though its meaning had evolved considerably. Each morning, before the demands of managing the estate consumed their day, Colton and Alara shared a quiet cup of tea together, sometimes in the grand dining room, but often, when time allowed, in the very stable where their friendship had first blossomed. It remained their private sanctuary, a reminder of simpler days and the honest foundation upon which their entire relationship had been built. Word of their unconventional love story eventually spread beyond the boundaries of Ashcombe Manor, reaching the wider social circles of the nobility who had initially doubted whether a duke's marriage to a former kitchen maid could possibly succeed. Some continued to whisper judgment from a distance, unable to accept such a departure from traditional expectations. But increasingly, others began to view Colton and Alara's partnership as something admirable, a genuine example of love built on honesty and mutual respect, rather than the calculated arrangements that had defined so many noble marriages throughout the region's history. Several young couples from neighboring estates, inspired by the story, found themselves questioning arrangements imposed upon them by ambitious families, drawing quiet courage from the example set by Ashcombe's unconventional duke and duchess. Colton, when he learned of this influence, felt a particular satisfaction, knowing that his own resistance to his father's arranged marriage years earlier had ultimately led not only to his own happiness, but had also inspired others to pursue genuine connection over calculated convenience. Beatrice, surprisingly, became an unexpected ally in the months following the council's final ruling. Her sharp mind for financial matters, once wielded as a weapon against Colton's inheritance, gradually shifted toward genuine partnership, offering valuable advice on estate management that helped Ashcombe continue its steady growth. She never fully abandoned her more calculating nature, but she developed a genuine fondness for Alara, occasionally seeking her counsel on matters far removed from estate business, conversations that would have seemed impossible during those tense early days of confrontation and threat. "I still cannot quite believe how thoroughly you disarmed me," Beatrice admitted during one such visit, sharing tea with Alara in the manor's sitting room. "I arrived fully prepared to see you removed from this estate within your first week as Duchess. Instead, I find myself genuinely valuing your friendship." "I never held your earlier actions against you," Alara replied honestly. You were protecting what you believed mattered most, even if your methods caused considerable pain along the way. I understand that kind of fierce protectiveness. I felt it myself toward Colton throughout everything that happened. Their friendship, unlikely as it had once seemed, became one of many unexpected blessings that grew from the difficult trials of that first tumultuous year. As seasons continued to change over Ashcombe Manor, Colton and Alara welcomed their first child, a daughter with her father's thoughtful eyes and her mother's warm, generous heart. They named her after Alara's late mother, honoring the woman whose early loss had set Alara on the unlikely path that eventually led her to love. And Margaret, upon holding the newest addition to the family she had watched grow and flourish over so many years, wept tears of pure joy at witnessing the full circle of a story she had helped nurture from its very first cold morning. The household staff, many of whom had served the estate for generations, spoke often of how different Ashcombe Manor felt under its new Duke and Duchess compared to the isolated, distant management of decades past. Workers who had once feared for their livelihoods now approached their responsibilities with genuine pride and security, knowing their voices and well-being mattered to the people governing their futures. Walter Higgins, who had witnessed the entire transformation from Colton's arrival, as a mysterious stable hand, through every subsequent trial and triumph, often remarked to newer staff members about the remarkable journey that had unfolded before his eyes. He told the story frequently during quiet evenings in the stable, of a kitchen maid who brought tea each morning to a stranger without expecting anything in return, and how that simple act of kindness had ultimately transformed the entire future of Ashcombe Manor for the better. Years later, when their daughter grew old enough to ask about how her parents had first met, Colton and Alara would take her to the very stable where their story began, now maintained not merely for practical purposes, but as a cherished piece of family history. They would tell her, in careful and loving detail, about cold mornings and quiet conversations, about secrets kept and truths eventually revealed, about the courage it took to choose honesty over convenience and love over calculated expectation. Your mother, Colton would tell their daughter, brought tea to a man she believed was nothing more than a humble stable hand, simply because she saw someone who was cold and alone, and she wanted to offer comfort without expecting anything in return. That kindness became the foundation of everything we built together. And your father, Alara would add, smiling warmly at her husband, chose honesty and love over every expectation placed upon him by title, family, and society, even when doing so risked everything he had worked to achieve. Their daughter would listen with wide, fascinated eyes, growing up understanding that true nobility had far less to do with titles and inheritance than with the genuine character revealed through kindness, courage, and unwavering honesty during life's most difficult trials. Ashcombe Manor flourished for generations following Colton and Alara's union, remembered not merely as another noble estate passed down through inheritance, but as a place where a simple act of kindness between two strangers had blossomed into a love story that changed the very foundation of how the family approached matters of the heart. The morning ritual continued long after Colton and Alara had grown old together, passed down through their children and grandchildren, a quiet daily reminder that the most meaningful connections often begin not with grand gestures or calculated arrangements, but with the simplest, most genuine acts of human kindness, offered freely, without expectation, to someone who needed it most. And every morning, without fail, as the sun rose gently over the hills surrounding Ashcombe Manor, someone would carry a warm cup of tea toward the old stable, honoring the humble beginning of a love that had proven, time and again, that true worth could never be measured by title or birth, but only by the honesty and courage carried within the human heart.